The emergency beacon pierced through the void of space like a desperate scream. Ambassador Zethkala of the Valerian Confederacy pressed his three-fingered hands against the communication console, his pale blue skin trembling as another explosion rocked their orbital station. Through the viewport, he could see the sleek black vessels of the Korthak Empire methodically destroying everything in their path. "The outer defensive grid is gone," reported Lieutenant Vash, her voice cracking with barely contained panic. "They're targeting the civilian evacuation ships now." Zethkala's large, dark eyes reflected the orange glow of burning debris floating past their window. The Korthak had come without warning, without demands, without mercy. Their plasma cannons turned passenger vessels into expanding clouds of superheated gas, while their boarding parties captured anyone who tried to flee in escape pods. The screams echoing through the station's communication channels painted a picture of horror that would haunt survivors for generations. "Sir, we're receiving responses to our distress signal," announced Communications Officer Rix, his mandibles clicking nervously. "The Altarian fleet says they cannot spare any vessels. The Centauran Defense Force claims they're dealing with their own border conflicts. The hegemony of worlds refuses to interfere in what they call a local dispute. Each rejection felt like a death sentence." Zethkala had served in the diplomatic corps for over 30 standard years, building relationships across a dozen star systems. He had believed in the power of civilized discourse, in the bonds of mutual cooperation that held their galactic community together. Now, as plasma fire lit up the darkness outside, those bonds proved as fragile as solar wind. "There is one more option," Rick said hesitantly, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "The Sol system. The humans." A collective shiver ran through the bridge crew. Everyone had heard the stories. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, a planet so hostile that most species couldn't survive there without extensive life support systems. The humans who had emerged from that nightmare realm were considered barely civilized by galactic standards. They were violent, aggressive, and prone to solving problems with what they cheerfully called kinetic solutions. "They're not even full members of the Galactic Council," protested Lieutenant Vash. "They're still in observer status, and their military doctrine is considered primitive." Zethkala watched another civilian transport explode in a brilliant flash of white light. Hundreds of families, children, elderly, all vaporized in an instant. The Korthak advance continued relentlessly, their dark ships moving through the destruction like predators through a feeding ground. "Primitive or not, they're our only hope," he said, reaching for the emergency beacon controls. "Send the distress call to Earth. Tell them the Confederacy is under attack and requests immediate military assistance." The message shot out across space at faster-than-light speeds, carrying with it the desperate plea of a dying civilization. Zethkala slumped in his command chair, wondering if he had just signed his people's death warrant or their salvation. The humans were unpredictable, wild, and dangerous, but perhaps that was exactly what they needed. 3 hours passed. The Korthak continued their methodical destruction, moving from station to station like a plague, consuming everything in its path. Most of the Confederacy's military vessels had been destroyed in the initial assault, their elegant designs no match for the Korthak's brutal efficiency. The few surviving ships were scattered, demoralized, and running low on ammunition. Then the space around the system's edge began to ripple. "Sir?" Rix called out, his voice filled with confusion and growing excitement. "We're detecting massive hyperspace signatures. Something big is coming through." The distortions grew larger, more violent than anything Zethkala had ever seen. Where other species emerged from hyperspace with gentle transitions, like ships sailing into a calm harbor, this felt like watching reality itself being torn apart. The very fabric of space seemed to scream as the unknown vessels forced their way into normal spacetime. The first ship that emerged was unlike anything in their databases. It was massive, angular, and covered in what looked like armor plating thick enough to stop asteroid impacts. Its hull was painted in intimidating patterns of black and dark gray, with markings that seemed to promise violence to anyone foolish enough to oppose it. More ships followed, each one different in design but united in their aura of barely contained destruction. "Incoming transmission," Rix announced, his mandibles now clicking rapidly with nervous energy. The view screen flickered to life, revealing a human face that made several bridge crew members instinctively step backward. The creature had forward-facing predator eyes, a strong jaw, and what appeared to be artificial markings on its skin. Its hair was cut short in a military style, and its expression was calm in a way that somehow seemed more terrifying than rage would have been. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force responding to your distress call," the human said, her voice carrying an accent that sounded like controlled thunder. "We received word that someone was having a pest control problem. Don't worry, we brought the right tools for the job." Behind her, Zethkala could see other humans moving efficiently through what was obviously a warship's bridge. They moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, each one looking like they had been forged in the fires of their infamous death world. Their technology appeared crude compared to the elegant systems of other civilizations, but there was something about its brutal functionality that sent chills down his spine. "The Korthak Empire has superior numbers and firepower," Zethkala managed to say. "Their fleet consists of over 300 vessels, including several dreadnoughts. Are you certain your forces can handle such odds?" Admiral Chen's lips curved in what Zethkala would later learn was called a smile, though it looked more like the expression a predator might wear before striking. "Ambassador, let me share something we learned a long time ago on Earth. When you're fighting for survival, you don't count the enemy. You make the enemy count." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in stunned silence. Through the viewport, they could see the human fleet moving into formation. Their ships looked rough, intimidating, and absolutely deadly. For the first time since the attack began, Zethkala felt something he had thought lost forever: hope. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the TDF Retribution, watching her tactical display with the calm focus of someone who had spent decades turning impossible situations into victories. The Korthak fleet spread across her sensors like a dark stain, their ships arranged in the typical formation of a species that had never faced real resistance. They moved with the arrogant precision of bullies who had grown comfortable with easy prey. "Ma'am, we're getting detailed scans of the enemy fleet," reported Lieutenant Commander Jackson, his fingers dancing across holographic controls. 317 vessels total. 48 heavy cruisers, 12 dreadnoughts, and the rest are destroyers and support craft. They're using plasma-based weapons and energy shields. Chen nodded, her mind already calculating angles and probabilities. "Any sign they've noticed us yet?" "Negative, Admiral. They're still focused on bombarding the civilian stations. It looks like their sensors aren't designed to detect our stealth approach." That was the thing about most galactic civilizations, Chen reflected. They had grown soft over the millennia, fighting wars with rules and conventions that made conflict almost civilized. They announced their intentions, followed predictable patterns, and rarely considered that an enemy might simply refuse to play by their established rules. Humans had never had that luxury. "Signal the fleet," she ordered. "Begin Operation Wasp Nest. All ships are to maintain radio silence until we reach the engagement zone." The human fleet moved through space like ghosts, their ships running dark and cold while specialized coating absorbed most electromagnetic signatures. Each vessel had been designed based on hard-won experience from humanity's bloodiest conflicts, incorporating lessons learned in the void between stars where mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Captain Maria Santos piloted her destroyer, the UES Havoc, through an asteroid field that the Korthak had dismissed as impassable. Her crew worked with the silent efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this scenario thousands of times. In the engine room, Chief Petty Officer Kim adjusted the reactor output to minimize their heat signature while keeping enough power ready for maximum acceleration. "Captain," whispered her tactical officer, "we're in position. The enemy dreadnought Korthmagoth is 2 kilometers directly ahead, focused on bombarding the medical station." Santos watched through her periscope as the massive alien warship continued its systematic destruction. The Korthak vessel was beautiful in its own way, with flowing lines and ornate decorations that spoke of a culture that valued aesthetic appeal even in their instruments of war. Unfortunately for them, beauty was not armor. 3 systems away, Commander David Park maneuvered his heavy cruiser, the UES Sledgehammer, into position behind the enemy formation. His ship carried the heaviest kinetic weapons in the human arsenal, including experimental railguns that could punch through a moon if properly calibrated. The targeting computer painted dozens of enemy ships in soft red light, calculating optimal impact points with mechanical precision. "Sir," reported his weapons officer, "we have firing solutions on 17 targets. Shall we prioritize the command vessels?" Negative, Park replied quietly. Hit the ships attacking civilians first. We can deal with their command structure after we stop the massacre. Aboard the UES Phantom, Commander Lisa Rodriguez checked her ship's complement of boarding pods one final time. Each pod contained a full squad of Terran Marines, men and women who had volunteered to launch themselves at enemy ships in armored capsules barely larger than coffins. Most galactic species considered such tactics suicidal, which was exactly why they worked so well. Marines, this is your commander speaking, Rodriguez announced over the internal comm. The enemy believes they're fighting a species of cowards and weaklings. They think war is about honor and following rules. Today we're going to teach them that sometimes war is just about who wants to survive more. The response from her Marines was a low growl that would have terrified any alien listener. These were volunteers from Earth's most dangerous environments. People who had grown up in the crushing depths of ocean trenches, the radiation-soaked ruins of old battlefields, and the frozen hell of polar research stations. They had trained in environments that would kill most aliens in minutes, and they were eager to introduce the Korthak to the concept of human hospitality. Back on the Retribution, Admiral Chen received confirmation signals from all her ships. The human fleet had positioned itself throughout the system like a carefully laid trap, each vessel hidden among debris or asteroid fields where alien sensors couldn't detect them. The Korthak continued their bombardment, completely unaware that they had just sailed into the hunting ground of Earth's finest predators. Admiral, reported her communications officer, we're receiving another transmission from Ambassador Zeth Kala. He's asking about our timeline for engagement. Chen glanced at the tactical display one more time, confirming that all her pieces were in position. The Korthak had spread their fleet thin to maximize the psychological impact of their attack, leaving each ship vulnerable to concentrated fire from multiple angles. Their formation was perfect for intimidating civilians, but terrible for actual combat against an opponent who fought back. Tell the ambassador that the Terran Defense Force is about to provide a demonstration of human problem-solving techniques, she said, and suggest that any remaining civilian ships might want to move to minimum safe distance. She opened a channel to all ships in her fleet, knowing that this moment would be recorded in history. When future generations studied this battle, they would see the exact moment when the galaxy learned that calling for help from a death world meant accepting the consequences of what might answer. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. The enemy has spent the last 6 hours murdering innocents and destroying civilian infrastructure. They came here expecting easy victims and soft targets. Instead, they found us. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to introduce the Korthak Empire to a concept they've apparently never encountered. Today they learn what happens when predators pick a fight with something higher up the food chain. The silence that followed was pregnant with anticipation. Across the system, human ships powered up their weapons, their crews moving with the deadly efficiency of a species that had earned its place among the stars through conquest of the most hostile planet in known space. All ships, Chen continued, her voice carrying the promise of retribution. Weapons free. Show them why nobody calls Earth for help unless they really, really need it. The first human missiles launched silently through the void, followed by railgun slugs moving at significant fractions of light speed. Within seconds, the Korthak Empire was about to discover the difference between conquest and survival. The first indication the Korthak had that something was terribly wrong came when the dreadnought Korthmagoth simply ceased to exist, Commander. Valakinth had been overseeing the destruction of a refugee convoy when his sensors registered an impossible reading. Something had struck his flagship at 17% of light speed, punching through their shields as if they were made of decorative fabric. The tungsten core of the human railgun slug vaporized on impact, but its kinetic energy was so enormous that it didn't matter. The dreadnought's entire forward section simply disintegrated, followed by a chain reaction that consumed the rest of the vessel in less than 3 seconds. What was that? Valakinth demanded, his mandibles clicking in confusion as he stared at the expanding cloud of debris where his most powerful ship had been moments before. Before anyone could answer, 17 more railgun slugs arrived from different vectors, each one finding a Korthak vessel bombarding civilian targets. The enemy ships died without warning, their crews never understanding what had killed them. In the span of 30 seconds, the Korthak Empire lost more military vessels than they had in the previous decade of conquest. Sir, we're detecting multiple missile launches from the asteroid fields, reported his sensor operator, voice trembling with panic. Estimated time to impact 23 seconds. Balakinth's four eyes widened as he realized the scope of their situation. The humans hadn't simply arrived to fight. They had somehow positioned an entire fleet within striking distance without being detected. His forces were scattered across the system, divided for maximum psychological impact against civilians, and completely unprepared for coordinated attack. All ships, defensive formation Veltok 7, he ordered. Focus shield power forward and prepare for... The missiles arrived before he could finish his sentence. Human torpedo technology was based on a simple principle that horrified most galactic civilizations. If you made something fast enough and dense enough, shields became irrelevant. The warheads weren't particularly sophisticated by alien standards, but they didn't need to be. Physics was physics, and kinetic energy was the most democratic force in the universe. Captain Santos watched with grim satisfaction as her torpedoes punched through the shields of 3 Korthak cruisers, each impact sending expanding spheres of vaporized metal into space. Her crew cheered as secondary explosions lit up their targets from within, but she remained focused on the tactical display. Helm, bring us about to bearing 27 Mark IV. Weapons, prepare the next salvo. Target their remaining heavy units. Ma'am, reported her tactical officer. The enemy is beginning to respond. They're trying to form a defensive perimeter around their command ships. Santos nodded grimly. The initial surprise was over. Now came the hard part. The Korthak were experienced warriors in their own right, and they would adapt quickly to the new threat. But they still didn't understand what they were really facing. Signal the fleet, she ordered. Execute pattern Omega. Let's show them how we hunt. Across the system, human ships began to move with a coordination that defied conventional military doctrine. Instead of maintaining formation, they scattered like a pack of wolves, each vessel following its own attack vector while maintaining perfect communication with the others. The Korthak tried to track them, but human ships were designed for exactly this kind of combat. Commander Park's cruiser emerged from behind a small moon, railguns already charging. His target was a Korthak heavy cruiser that was attempting to organize a counterattack against Admiral Chen's flagship. The alien ship was magnificent, covered in ornate armor plating and powered by technology that was centuries ahead of anything in human databases. None of that mattered when 200 kilograms of tungsten struck it at 18% of light. Speed. Direct hit, reported his weapons officer. Target is... Well, sir, there isn't really a target anymore. Park was already moving to the next firing position. Helm, take us to Grid 7 Alpha. Tactical, find me another heavy unit. These bastards want to play Conqueror? Let's teach them the rules. Meanwhile, Commander Rodriguez's Marines were about to introduce the Korthak to an entirely new form of warfare. Her boarding pods launched like spears through space, each one containing a squad of humans who had volunteered for what most species would consider a suicide mission. Marine Sergeant Mike Torres felt the familiar weight of acceleration as his pod accelerated toward a Korthak destroyer. Around him, his squad checked their weapons one final time. They carried equipment that looked primitive compared to alien technology, but it was designed by a species that had learned to kill efficiently in the harshest environment imaginable. 60 seconds to impact, announced the pod's navigation system. All Marines, prepare for boarding action. Torres grinned inside his helmet. The Korthak were about to discover that when humans couldn't destroy something from the outside, they got creative about destroying it from within. Listen up, people, he announced to his squad. Remember your training. These aliens think war is about honor and following rules. We're about to teach them that sometimes war is just about who's willing to do whatever it takes to win. The boarding pods struck the Korthak destroyer's hull like bullets, their armored tips punching through the relatively thin outer plating. Automated cutters carved entry holes while the Marines inside prepared for what was essentially controlled falling with extreme prejudice. Torres was the first through the breach, his assault rifle already scanning for targets. The corridor beyond was filled with Korthak crew members who had never faced an enemy that could appear inside their own ship. They fumbled for weapons that were designed for elegant dueling rather than close-quarters combat in confined spaces. The firefight that followed lasted exactly 43 seconds. Across the system, similar scenes played out as human boarding parties carved through ship after ship. The Korthak had superior technology and overwhelming numbers, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to fight by civilized rules. Every human tactic violated some convention of galactic warfare, and that was exactly the point. Admiral Chen watched the battle unfold from her command center, noting with professional satisfaction how quickly the enemy formation was disintegrating. The Korthak were trying to adapt, but their entire military doctrine was based on fighting opponents who shared their cultural assumptions about honor and proper conduct in warfare. Humans had no such limitations, Admiral, reported her tactical officer. Enemy fleet strength is down to 68%. They're attempting to withdraw toward the system edge. Chen's expression didn't change. Signal all ships. Nobody leaves. Today the galaxy learns that there are consequences for targeting civilians. She opened a channel to the surviving Korthak command ship, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but the future relationship between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. Attention, Korthak forces. This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Defense Force. You came here to commit genocide against innocent civilians. You have one chance to surrender unconditionally and submit to judgment by the Galactic Council. Refuse, and we will demonstrate why Earth is classified as a death world. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of human weapons charging for another attack. Commander Valakinth stared at the tactical display in disbelief. His invasion fleet, which had seemed unstoppable mere hours ago, was being systematically destroyed by an enemy he had barely considered a threat. The humans fought like nothing he had ever encountered, using tactics that violated every convention of civilized warfare. "Sir," reported his communications officer, her voice shaking with barely controlled terror, "the human fleet has completely surrounded us. They're not responding to our surrender broadcasts." "What do you mean they're not responding?" Valakinth demanded. "All civilized species accept surrender. It's basic galactic law." The officer's mandibles clicked nervously. "Sir, I don't think they consider themselves bound by galactic law. Their last transmission called us war criminals and said something about making an example." Through the viewport, Valakinth could see the sleek forms of human ships moving through the debris of his fleet, like predators circling wounded prey. They moved with a fluid grace that spoke of countless hours of practice in real combat, not the parade formations favored by most galactic militaries. "Commander," interrupted his tactical officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the human flagship. It's addressed to you personally." The main screen flickered to life, revealing Admiral Chen's face. Up close, the human looked even more intimidating than before. Her eyes held a cold intelligence that reminded him uncomfortably of the apex predators from his homeworld's ancient history. "Commander Valakinth," she said, her voice carrying across space with digital clarity, "I understand you're having difficulty accepting surrender. Let me clarify the situation. You are not prisoners of war. You are not protected by any treaty. You are criminals who targeted civilian populations, and under Terran law, that makes you enemies of humanity itself." Valakinth straightened his spine, trying to project authority despite his deteriorating situation. "I demand to speak with your superior." "According to Galactic Convention, I am my superior," Chen interrupted, "and Galactic Convention doesn't apply here. You see, Commander, when you decided to massacre civilians, you moved beyond the boundaries of civilized conflict. You entered what humans call total war, and in total war there are only two outcomes: victory or death." The transmission ended, leaving the Korthak bridge in stunned silence. Valakinth had fought dozens of campaigns across the galaxy, but he had never encountered an enemy who simply refused to acknowledge the rules of engagement. The humans weren't just defeating his forces. They were treating his entire species as something to be exterminated. "Sir," whispered his sensor operator, "I'm detecting movement in the debris field. Multiple contacts moving toward our position." On his tactical display, Valakinth watched in growing horror as human ships emerged from the wreckage of his own fleet. They had been hiding among the debris, using the destroyed Korthak vessels as cover while they positioned themselves for another attack. It was a level of strategic thinking that bordered on the supernatural. The next wave of human attacks came from every direction simultaneously. Missiles launched from concealed positions while railgun slugs arrived from impossible angles. The remaining Korthak ships found themselves caught in a crossfire that made tactical response nearly impossible. Captain Santos watched her torpedoes impact the enemy formation with professional satisfaction. The Korthak were still trying to fight like this was a civilized engagement between rational opponents. They maintained formation, followed predictable movement patterns, and wasted precious time trying to communicate with ships that no longer existed. "Ma'am," reported her tactical officer, "enemy fleet strength is down to 37%. Shall we offer them another chance to surrender?" Santos considered the question while watching a Korthak heavy cruiser explode in brilliant silence. "Negative. They had their chance when Admiral Chen made the offer. Now they get to experience what happens when you target human civilians." Her ship moved through space like a hunting shark, seeking new targets among the scattered remnants of the Korthak fleet. Behind her, the rest of the human formation continued their deadly dance, each vessel operating independently while maintaining perfect coordination with the others. Commander Rodriguez's boarding parties had completed their mission aboard 17 enemy ships, leaving behind crews that were either dead or wishing they were. Her Marines had carved through the Korthak vessels with brutal efficiency, using tactics that would have been considered war crimes if applied to legitimate military targets. But these weren't legitimate military targets. These were ships that had spent the morning murdering refugee convoys and bombarding medical stations. "Ma'am," reported Sergeant Torres over the comm, "we've secured another destroyer. The crew surrendered after we breached their bridge. What are your orders?" Rodriguez considered her options while watching the tactical display. The Korthak had clearly expected this to be a standard conquest, the kind of civilized warfare where defeated enemies were treated with respect and dignity. They hadn't prepared for the possibility that their opponents might view civilian killers as something less than legitimate combatants. "Secure the prisoners and prepare demolition charges," she ordered. "That ship will never threaten another civilian convoy." Across the system, the pattern repeated as human forces systematically dismantled what remained of the Korthak invasion fleet. It wasn't enough to defeat them. The humans seemed determined to ensure that the enemy understood the consequences of their actions. Admiral Chen monitored the battle from her command center, noting with grim satisfaction how quickly Korthak resistance was collapsing. Her ships had adapted to every enemy countermeasure, responding to each tactical change with overwhelming force applied at exactly the right moment. "Admiral," reported her intelligence officer, "we're intercepting Korthak communications. They're calling for reinforcements from their home fleet." "Are they now?" Chen mused, studying the tactical display. "How long until those reinforcements arrive?" "Approximately 6 days, ma'am. The nearest Korthak battle group is currently 2 systems away." Chen nodded thoughtfully. 6 days was more than enough time to complete the current mission and prepare a proper welcome for any additional Korthak forces that might be foolish. "Enough to test human resolve. Signal all ships," she ordered. "Begin Phase 2 of the operation. I want every military installation in this system identified and neutralized. If the Korthak want to send reinforcements, let's make sure they find exactly nothing worth reinforcing." Lieutenant Commander Jackson looked up from his sensor station with a questioning expression. "Ma'am, are we taking prisoners?" Chen considered the question while watching another Korthak ship disappear in a ball of expanding plasma. The enemy had come here to commit genocide against innocent civilians, trusting in their superior numbers and advanced technology to guarantee victory. They had calculated that the risk was acceptable because nobody would be willing to fight hard enough to stop them. They had been catastrophically wrong about that last part. "We'll take prisoners," she said finally, "but make sure they understand that they're not prisoners of war. They're war criminals being held for trial by the Galactic Council, and if any of them give our people trouble, remind them that we're being merciful only because we choose to be." Through the viewport, she could see the last few Korthak ships attempting to flee toward the system edge. They wouldn't make it, of course. Human ships were faster, and their crews were motivated by something the enemy clearly didn't understand. When you called Earth for help, you weren't just requesting military assistance. You were invoking the protection of a species that had earned its place among the stars by refusing to accept defeat under any circumstances whatsoever. The Lydium Korthak Empire was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The last Korthak ship died in silence, its hull cracked open like an egg by a human railgun slug that arrived at nearly 20% of light speed. Commander Valakanth watched from his escape pod as the vessel that had been his home for 15 years disintegrated into expanding clouds of superheated debris. Around him floated hundreds of other escape pods, each one containing survivors from what had once been the most powerful invasion fleet in Korthak history. They had entered this system as conquerors, confident in their superiority and contemptuous of the weak civilizations they intended to subjugate. Now they were refugees, floating helplessly in the void while human ships moved among them like sharks deciding which prey to take first. "This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Defense Force," came a transmission that reached every pod simultaneously. "You are under arrest for crimes against sentient life, including but not limited to the deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the destruction of medical facilities, and attempted genocide. You will be transferred to holding facilities pending trial by the Galactic Council." Valakinth felt his mandibles click involuntarily. A trial by the Galactic Council? Most species simply absorbed defeated enemies into their own populations or negotiated peaceful surrender terms. The idea of actually putting military commanders on trial for following orders was almost incomprehensible. "Furthermore," Admiral Chen continued, "let me make something crystal clear. You are alive because we choose to let you live. Earth's military doctrine regarding civilian killers is significantly less merciful than what you're experiencing today. Consider this a demonstration of human restraint, not human weakness." The first human recovery ship arrived like a predator approaching wounded prey. It was massive, angular, and painted in the same intimidating colors as the rest of their fleet. As it maneuvered alongside the escape pods, Valakinth could see armed figures moving through its corridors, each one wearing armor that looked like it had been designed for fighting in hell itself. When the airlock opened, 3 human soldiers entered his pod with weapons drawn. Up close, the aliens were even more intimidating than they appeared on video transmissions. They moved with the fluid grace of natural hunters, their eyes constantly scanning for threats while their hands remained ready to draw weapons at the slightest provocation. "Commander Valakinth," said the lead soldier, consulting a datapad with his free hand. "You're the one who gave the order to target civilian evacuation ships?" "I was following the strategic doctrine of the Korthak Empire," Valakinth replied, trying to maintain some dignity despite his circumstances. "Civilian morale is a legitimate military target." The human soldier's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Civilian morale. Right, tell me, Commander, how many children do you estimate were on those evacuation ships?" Valakinth hesitated, suddenly uncertain. That's not relevant to military planning." "It's relevant to us," the soldier said quietly. "See, humans have this strange idea that targeting children makes you something other than a soldier, something that needs to be put down like a rabid animal." They transferred Valakinth and his officers to the human detention ship with an efficiency that spoke of extensive practice. The holding cells were Spartan but functional, designed for containing dangerous criminals rather than honored prisoners of war. Through the reinforced viewports, he could see other human ships continuing their systematic destruction of every Korthak installation in the system. They weren't just defeating his forces. They were erasing every trace of Korthak presence as if it were a contamination that needed to be cleansed. Meanwhile, Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching the final phase of the operation unfold with professional satisfaction. Her ships had performed flawlessly, adapting to every enemy countermeasure while maintaining the kind of tactical flexibility that came from years of experience fighting desperate battles against impossible odds. "Admiral," reported her intelligence officer, "we've completed the scan of all Korthak data cores. The information we've recovered indicates this was just the first wave of their invasion plan." Chen nodded grimly. "Show me." The tactical display shifted to show a star map covering dozens of systems, each one marked with Korthak military symbols. The scope of their planned conquest was staggering, encompassing nearly a quarter of known galactic civilization. They were planning to hit 17 different systems simultaneously. The intelligence officer continued. Each target was chosen for maximum psychological impact. Medical colonies, refugee settlements, research stations full of civilian scientists, and the other invasion fleets, already en route to their targets, ma'am. We estimate they'll begin their attacks within the next 72 hours. Chen studied the display with growing anger. The Korthak hadn't just attacked the Valerian Confederacy. They had planned a campaign of systematic terror against anyone too weak to fight back effectively. It was genocide disguised as military strategy, and it would not be tolerated. "Signal the Admiralty," she ordered. "Full priority transmission. We need every available ship mobilized for Operation Shepherd's Watch. If the Korthak want to wage war on civilians, they can try doing it against us instead." Her communications officer hesitated. Ma'am, that would require deploying nearly the entire Terran Defense Force. Earth would be left with minimal protection. Chen's smile was cold enough to freeze hydrogen. Officer, by the time we're finished with the Korthak Empire, they won't have enough ships left to threaten a space station, much less Earth. Besides, the best defense is making sure your enemies are too dead to attack you. She turned to address her tactical staff. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 17 civilian populations under threat from an enemy that specializes in murdering the defenseless. This is exactly why the Terran Defense Force exists. We're going to split our forces and hit every single one of those invasion fleets before they can complete their objectives. The bridge crew exchanged glances that mixed excitement with grim determination. What Admiral Chen was proposing was tactically insane by conventional standards, but it was exactly the kind of calculated madness that had made humanity's military reputation throughout the galaxy. "Ma'am?" asked her tactical officer. "What about the Korthak reinforcements heading this way?" "We'll leave a small task force to deal with them," Chen replied. "Something appropriate for teaching object lessons about the consequences of targeting human-protected civilians." She opened a channel to the detention ship where Commander Valakinth and his officers were being held. The defeated Korthak commander appeared on her screen, looking defeated but still defiant. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying across space with digital clarity, "I thought you should know that we've reviewed your invasion plans. Very thorough, very ambitious. Unfortunately for your people, it looks like you've bitten off considerably more than you can chew. The Korthak Empire has thousands of ships," Valakinth replied with more confidence than he felt. "You cannot be everywhere at once." Chen's smile widened slightly. "Commander, let me share something we learned during our early days of space exploration. When you're dealing with predators, you don't need to be everywhere at once. You just need to make sure that everywhere you show up, you leave an impression that lasts." The transmission ended, leaving Valakinth alone with the growing realization that his people had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The humans weren't just another species to be conquered. They were something else entirely, something that emerged from the depths of space like an avenging angel whenever innocent blood was shed. Through his cell viewport, he could see human ships preparing for hyperspace jumps that would carry them to 17 different systems, where Korthak fleets were preparing to repeat the atrocities he had attempted here. Each ship moved with the deadly purpose of a species that had learned to fight for survival in the most hostile environment imaginable. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when someone was foolish enough to threaten civilians under human protection. Was not going to be a lesson the Korthak Empire survived. 6 months after the Battle of the Valerian Confederacy, Ambassador Zethkala stood before the Galactic Council in the Great Assembly Hall on Centauri Prime. The vast amphitheater held representatives from over 300 species, each one eager to hear the official report on humanity's intervention in what historians were already calling the Korthak War. "Honored delegates," Zethkala began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustics. "When the Confederacy called for aid against the Korthak invasion, we expected military assistance. What we received was something far more significant, a demonstration that the galaxy still contains species willing to fight for principles rather than profit." The assembly remained unusually quiet. Everyone present had heard the preliminary reports, but the full scope of what the humans had accomplished was still difficult to comprehend. The Terran Defense Force deployed across 17 star systems simultaneously, intercepting Korthak invasion fleets before they could complete their planned atrocities. In every engagement, they demonstrated tactical superiority despite being outnumbered by ratios ranging from 3-to-1 to 15-to-1. Representative Korthvel of the Altarian Commonwealth shifted uncomfortably in his gravity chair. His government had refused to provide assistance during the crisis, claiming they couldn't spare military assets for what they called a regional dispute. "The humans didn't simply defeat the Korthak forces," Zethkala continued. "They systematically dismantled their entire military infrastructure, captured their leadership, and delivered them to council jurisdiction for trial. The Korthak Empire, which had threatened galactic peace for over 2 centuries, has ceased to exist as a military power." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The speed and totality of the Korthak collapse had shocked everyone who understood the military realities involved. The Empire had possessed one of the largest fleets in known space, equipped with technology that was centuries ahead of most civilizations. Furthermore, Zethkala added, the humans accomplished this while suffering minimal casualties and causing minimal damage to civilian infrastructure in the affected systems. Their precision was remarkable. What he didn't mention was how the humans had achieved such precision. The classified reports contained details that would have horrified most council delegates. Human ships emerging from hyperspace inside enemy formations, boarding parties that fought through warships like viruses consuming a host, weapons that violated several galactic conventions regarding acceptable force levels. The humans had fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen, using tactics that blurred the line between military engagement and systematic extermination. The Council recognizes the representative from Earth, announced the speaker, a dignified being whose species had been mediating galactic disputes for millennia. Admiral Chen rose from the human delegation section, her dress uniform somehow managing to look both formal and vaguely threatening. She had been promoted after the campaign, though most observers suspected it was mainly to give her enough authority to speak for Earth in situations like this. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had ordered the destruction of the Korthak Empire. I want to address some concerns that have been raised about human military doctrine. The assembly grew even quieter. Several species had filed formal complaints about human tactics, claiming they violated galactic conventions regarding proportional response and civilian protection. Some of you have suggested that humanity's methods were excessive, that we used unnecessary force against an enemy that might have been defeated through conventional diplomacy. I want to respond to those concerns directly. Admiral Chen activated a holographic display that showed images from the Korthak invasion. Burning medical stations, destroyed evacuation ships, the bodies of civilians floating in space. This is what the Korthak Empire considered acceptable military strategy. The deliberate targeting of non-combatants, the destruction of medical facilities, the systematic murder of refugees. When faced with an enemy that operates by these standards, humanity chooses to respond with what we call overwhelming decisive action. The images changed to show human rescue operations, medical ships treating alien wounded, evacuation vessels carrying survivors to safety, human marines providing security for refugee camps. Every human ship that participated in this campaign carried full medical facilities and refugee accommodation. Every engagement was planned to minimize civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. We destroyed military targets with extreme prejudice while simultaneously protecting non-combatants with our own lives. Representative Velmora of the Hegemony of Worlds raised a tentacle in question. Admiral Chen, while we appreciate humanity's dedication to civilian protection, many of us are concerned about the finality of your response. The Korthak Empire has been completely eliminated as a political entity. Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. Representative Velmora, let me be absolutely clear about human policy regarding civilizations that target non-combatants. We don't negotiate with them. We don't seek diplomatic solutions with them. We don't accept their surrender and allow them to rebuild for future atrocities. The silence in the chamber was complete now. When a species demonstrates that it views civilian populations as legitimate military targets, humanity classifies that species as what we term a clear and present danger to galactic peace. Such threats are eliminated completely and permanently. Representative Korthavel made a sound that might have been a nervous laugh. Surely, Admiral, you don't mean to suggest that humanity would take such extreme action against any species that... Representative, Chen interrupted quietly. Your government refused to provide aid during the Korthak crisis. You claimed you were too busy with border conflicts to help defend civilian populations. I want you to understand something very clearly. She turned to address the entire assembly, her voice carrying to every corner of the Great Hall. Humanity is now fully integrated into galactic civilization. We trade with your merchants, we cooperate with your scientists. We participate in your cultural exchanges. We want to be good neighbors and trusted allies. The holographic display changed again, showing human ships patrolling trade routes, human engineers helping to build infrastructure on developing worlds, human medical teams responding to natural disasters across dozens of systems. But understand this, she continued. If any species anywhere in the galaxy decides to target civilian populations, they will answer to us. If any government chooses to ignore calls for help from innocent victims, they will answer to us. If any military force decides that murder and terror are acceptable tools of conquest, they will answer to us. Admiral Chen's gaze swept across the assembly, meeting the eyes of representatives who had spent centuries believing that galactic peace was maintained through careful diplomacy and mutual economic interest. "We are offering you a choice," she said. "You can be part of a civilization that protects the innocent and defends the defenseless, or you can be part of the problem that needs to be solved." The silence stretched for long moments before the speaker found his voice. "The Council recognizes humanity's contribution to galactic security and formally accepts Earth's application for full membership with all associated rights and responsibilities." The vote was unanimous, not because every species loved humanity, but because every species understood what the alternative would mean. Outside the assembly hall, Ambassador Zeth Kala found Admiral Chen standing on an observation deck, looking out at the stars visible through the transparent aluminum. "Admiral," he said quietly, "was it really necessary to be quite so direct?" Chen smiled without turning around. "Ambassador, 6 months ago my species was considered barely civilized by galactic standards. We were observers, not participants. Now, every government in known space understands that civilian populations are under human protection, whether they requested it or not." She turned to face him, and Zeth Kala saw something in her eyes that reminded him why Earth was classified as a death world. Sometimes the only way to ensure peace is to make war so terrible that nobody wants to risk it. The galaxy is safer now because everyone understands the consequences of targeting innocent people. As if summoned by her words, a human patrol ship passed by the observation deck, its hull marked with symbols that had become recognized throughout known space. The emblem of the Terran Defense Force, and below it words in the ancient human language called English. "Si vis pacem, parabellum," Admiral Chen translated quietly. "If you want peace, prepare for war." The ship disappeared into hyperspace, carrying its message to star systems across the galaxy. Earth was watching. Earth was waiting. And Earth would not tolerate the murder of innocents. The age of galactic peace had begun, enforced by the children of a death world who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect life was to become very, very good at ending it.